At dinner, my mother set her fork down deliberately, placing it flat against her plate. She had just informed me that I had 1 month to find a new place to live. They'd sold the house. I wasn't going with them. There had been no warning, no discussion. My father stared at his plate as if the patterns in the ceramic held the answers. My sister smiled, a small, private curve of her lips. By morning, their suitcases were gone, and the house echoed with a hollow silence that felt like I had never lived there at all. 6 months later, my phone buzzed on the countertop. A single message from my mother glowed on the screen. "Why are you still there?" I laughed, a dry sound in the quiet kitchen. She had no idea who owned that house now. Before I tell you how this happened, I need to start from the beginning. My name is Clara. I'm 26 years old and I work in tech. On paper, that sounds impressive. In real life, it just means long hours staring at a screen, cold coffee forgotten on my desk, and a brain that hums with code long after I've clocked out. I've always kept my head down. No flashy clothes, no big announcements on social media. If you passed me on the street or in a grocery aisle, you'd probably never look twice. That's how my family always saw me too, someone who blended into the wallpaper. From the outside, we looked like a normal American family. A decent house in a quiet neighborhood, dinner together most nights, holiday photos where everyone smiled on cue. But inside those walls, there existed a quiet hierarchy, an unspoken understanding everyone felt without ever needing to voice it. My mother, Elena, ran everything: the schedule, the rules, the very tone of the room. She had a particular way of smiling without any warmth, as if affection were a transaction, something you earned through compliance, not something you were owed by birth. My father, Robert, rarely challenged her. He wasn't a cruel man, just profoundly absent in the moments it truly mattered. When tension thickened the air, he would find something suddenly fascinating about his dinner plate, studying it with intense focus. Then there were my sisters. The younger one, Chloe, was still in high school, loud, dramatic, and accustomed to being indulged. The older one, Sophia, in her early 20s, carried herself with a poised certainty as if the world had already promised her more. Their voices filled the space at the dinner table, weaving stories and opinions about their lives, about my job, about how quiet I was, about how I never seemed to be going anywhere. My own voice barely ever left my throat. I learned early not to ask for much. My birthdays were small, sometimes remembered only in the late evening with a hurried generic card. Family vacations were suddenly too expensive. If I wanted to come along, yet somehow remained affordable when it was just the 4 of them. I stayed home often, watching the house, cleaning up after they left, learning how to be useful without being noticed. By the time I was a teenager, I got a job after school bagging groceries, not for spending money, but because asking my parents for anything, new shoes, a textbook, a ride, felt too much like begging. With my first few paychecks, I bought a used laptop. It wasn't pretty, the casing was cracked and it overheated, whining like it was perpetually tired. But it was mine. That chunky, whirring machine changed everything. I began teaching myself to code late at night, sitting cross-legged on my bed while the rest of the house slept. Lines of logic and function made sense in a way people never had. You put the work in, you followed the rules, and you got a result. There was no favoritism, no guessing at the right thing to say. Still, at home, nothing changed. I paid a share of the rent once I had a real job, covered all my own expenses, and stayed quiet. I let them believe whatever they wanted about my life and my prospects. I told myself it was temporary, a necessary holding pattern. As long as I kept my head down, I could survive there a little longer, save a little more. I just didn't realize they'd already decided I was disposable. That final dinner didn't start out any different from 100 others. The kitchen was warm, smelling of roast chicken and black pepper. Plates clinked softly. My mother moved around with that tight, efficient energy she always carried when she already made a decision and was merely waiting for the right moment to announce it. I sat in my usual spot, shoulders still tense from a long day, mentally planning to eat quickly and disappear upstairs. My father cleared his throat once, a rough sound, then sank back into silence. My sisters. leaned toward each other, whispering and smiling like they were privy to a joke I wasn't supposed to hear. Halfway through the meal, my mother set her fork down. The sound was precise. "I need everyone's attention," she said, her voice calm and measured. Then her eyes found mine. "Especially you, Clara." Something cold and sharp tightened in my chest. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't look angry. That was the worst part. She spoke as if she were reading from a mundane checklist. The house had been sold. The paperwork was finalized. They were moving. Tomorrow. I blinked. "Moving? Where?" "That's not important," she replied, waving a hand slightly. "What matters is that you'll need to find somewhere else to live. You have a month." The words didn't land all at once. They stacked one heavy block upon another. Sold, moving, a month. I looked at my father. He wouldn't meet my eyes. His hands were folded on the table, his knuckles pale. When I turned to my sisters, Sophia was smirking. Chloe pressed her lips together, a poorly concealed laugh trembling behind them. "You're serious?" I asked, my own voice sounding distant. My mother gave a single firm nod. "We're not taking you with us." She said it so cleanly, so plainly it almost sounded reasonable, as if this were the natural order of things and I'd simply missed the memo. My father finally spoke, his eyes still on his hands. "You're an adult, Clara. You should have planned for this. Planned for my family selling the house without telling me." Chloe snorted. "Guess you better start packing," she chirped. "Tech jobs don't pay that well, right?" They laughed. Not loudly, not cruelly enough to make a scene, just enough to let the sting linger. They left the next morning. I woke to the low rumble of a car engine idling in the driveway and the solid, final sound of doors slamming shut. For one disorienting moment, rap. Ed in the thin light of dawn. I thought I had dreamed the whole terrible dinner. Then I heard my mother's heels on the hardwood floor downstairs. Sharp, rapid clicks that sounded like punctuation marking the end of a sentence. By the time I walked into the living room, dressed in yesterday's clothes, the transformation was stark. Boxes were stacked neatly by the front door. The couch was gone, leaving only faint indentations in the carpet. The family photos had been taken off the walls, leaving behind pale, ghostly rectangles where our smiling faces used to hang. My father stood by the large front window, car keys already in his hand, his posture angled toward the outside, whirled as if he were already halfway there. My mother glanced at me as she adjusted the collar of her coat, her look one of brisk efficiency, like she was checking one last item off a master list. "Remember," she said, her voice carrying no particular emotion, "you've got a month. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Harder for who? I thought but didn't ask. My sisters breezed past me, each carrying a final bag. Chloe was laughing about the size of her new closet. Sophia was discussing the coffee shops in their new neighborhood, the word fresh start floating between them. No one hugged me. No one asked if I was okay or where I might go. The front door closed with a soft, definitive click, and just like that, the house plunged into a new kind of quiet. It wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was a hollow, echoing quiet. I stood in the center of the empty living room for a long time after their car disappeared down the tree-lined street. The air itself felt different, thinner, colder, without the constant undercurrent of their voices and movements. Every small sound I made seemed amplified. The shuffle of my socks on the floor, my own steady breathing, the persistent hum of the refrigerator they hadn't be othered to empty. I walked through the house slowly, room by empty room. My childhood home had been reduced to a shell, bare walls, empty shelves, closets gaping open with a few forgotten wire hangers inside, and somehow I was the only thing left within it. The weight of it finally hit me then, not as a surge of panic or a childish fear, but as a heavy, sinking stone of realization in my gut. My family had made a clean break. They hadn't argued. They hadn't hesitated. They had simply convened, decided I was no longer worth the space I occupied, and executed their plan with detached precision. I sat down on the bare floor of the living room, my back against a wall still marked from where a bookcase once stood, and I stared at the dust motes dancing in a sliver of sunlight. This was usually the point where I would cry, where I would spiral, blaming myself, wondering what fatal flaw in me had made this inevitable. But instead of heat behind my eyes, something colder settled into my bones, a clarity, sharp as glass. Because the truth was, this betrayal hadn't come out of nowhere. The seeds had been planted 2 months earlier, during another lonely, quiet night. I'd been scrolling through real estate listings online, a half-hearted, weary exercise in imagining a future escape of my own. That's when I saw it. My address. Photos of this living room, this kitchen, my bedroom, professionally staged, polished, and presented to the world as if I were already a memory. They had put the house up for sale without saying a single word to me. I remembered the physical jolt that went through me, sitting at my old desk in the dark. The hurt came first, a swift and familiar ache, then anger, hot and blinding. But then, cutting through both, came a wave of pure ice-cold clarity. It was the clearest I had felt in years. I didn't confront them. I didn't scream or cry or demand explanations. I closed the browser tab. I made a call instead. While they were packing boxes and painting over the past and planning their future without me in it, I was quietly, methodically setting something else in motion. Something legal, something financial, something utterly irreversible. Back in the empty living room, the memory of that call fortifying me, I pushed myself up from the floor and brushed the dust from my hands. The house still felt too big, too silent. But for the first time, it also felt honest. Stripped of their presence, it was just a structure, one whose fate was no longer in their hands. They thought they were abandoning me. What they didn't know was that the moment they walked out that door was the moment I stopped being the person they could step over without a single consequence. And I knew, with a calm certainty, that the next time we spoke, the balance of power would not belong to them anymore. 6 months passed, not quietly, not magically, but steadily. The house changed first, not in the way of a dramatic makeover show, but intentionally, slowly becoming my own. New furniture, clean-lined and chosen by me, filled the empty spaces. A thick rug soaked up the echoes in the living room. The kitchen smelled like fresh coffee and my own cooking again. At night, the lights stayed on in rooms because I wanted them to, not because I was waiting for someone else to come home. I changed, too. I found myself standing straighter, my shoulders no longer curling inward. I slept through the nights, a deep and dreamless rest. I stopped flinching every time my phone buzzed with a notification. The silence, once so hollow, became a space I could breathe in. They never checked in. Not a single time. No, are you okay? No, did you find a place? Nothing. I think, in their minds, the problem of Clara had been neatly solved. I had vanished. I was someone else's problem now. A burden they had successfully offloaded. Then, one overcast afternoon as I worked from home, my phone vibrated against the wooden desk. The screen lit up with a name I hadn't seen in half a year, Mom. I stared at it, the light washing over my fingers longer than was necessary. When I finally opened the message, it contained only 6 stark words. Why are you still there? No greeting, no pretense of concern, just pure confusion, tinged with unmistakable annoyance. I laughed then. Not out loud, just a quiet, incredulous breath through my nose. The kind of laugh that escapes when the last missing piece of a puzzle clicks perfectly into place. I didn't reply. An hour later, another message arrived, then a missed call, then another. I let them sit there, glowing with unread urgency, while I calmly finished my work. When I finally closed my laptop, the house was quiet, and I felt a settled, grounded calm. They were about to find out. And I was in no rush to help them. That Saturday morning, I heard a familiar engine rumble into the driveway. I didn't look out the window right away. I already knew who it was. The doorbell rang, a sharp, impatient sound. I took my time. I finished pouring my coffee, smoothed the front of my sweater, took one deep, centering breath. Then I walked to the door and opened it. They stood there on the porch, all 4 of them, arranged like a portrait of a family, expecting to be let back into a place that still belonged to them. My mother's practiced, polite smile froze, and then shattered the second her eyes traveled past me, into the living room, taking in the new couch, the patterned rug, the framed art on the walls. Sophia's eyes darted around, calculating. Chloe's mouth actually fell open in a soft, stunned gasp. What is all this? my mother asked, her voice tight. She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, her heels clicking. On the hardwood she no longer owned. My father followed, silent as ever, his gaze fixed on the floor as if it might offer an escape. Sophia trailed her fingers along the back of the velvet sofa, her touch hesitant, as if afraid it might dissolve. "This stuff isn't cheap," she muttered, almost to herself. I closed the door softly behind them. The click of the latch was loud in the quiet room. "Sit," I said, my voice even, gesturing toward the chairs. They did, my mother perching on the edge of an armchair, folding her hands primly in her lap, struggling to reassemble her composure. "Clara," she began, the name sounding strange in her mouth, "we need to talk about what's going on here." I leaned back in my own chair, cradling my coffee mug. "You mean why I'm still living in my house?" Her head snapped up. "Your house?" "Mine," I repeated evenly. A silence dropped into the room, thick and heavy. "That's not funny," my father said finally, his voice a low rumble. "I'm not joking." My mother's strained smile returned. "A brittle thing. You don't have that kind of money?" I shrugged one shoulder. "You'd be surprised what can happen when no one is watching you." Chloe scoffed, finding her voice. "You're saying you bought this place?" "Yes." "With what?" Sophia demanded, her poise cracking into sharpness. "You were barely making rent before." I allowed myself a small, slight smile. "That's what you thought." My mother stood up so fast her chair scraped harshly against the floor. "Explain. Right now." So I did. Not every detail, not the specific numbers that would make their heads spin, just the clean, simple truth. I worked in tech. I hadn't just been working a job, I'd been building things quietly for years. I'd partnered with a brilliant, trustworthy friend. We had done well, better than well. "I saw the listing," I said, holding my mother's widening gaze. "Months before. You ever told me. You put this house up for sale while I was still living in it, paying to live in it. So I made a decision." The color drained from my mother's face, leaving her looking strangely fragile. You let us sell it to you." "I bought it," I corrected, my tone factual. "Legally through a third-party LLC. Everything is handled, the payments, the taxes, the deed, all of it." The room seemed to grow smaller, the walls pressing in on them. My father rubbed his temples with trembling fingers. "Why didn't you tell us?" he asked, a plea in his voice. I met his eyes, and for the first time, I didn't look away. "Because you didn't ask," Chloe jumped in, her voice rising with a childish sense of injustice. "If you had money, you should have helped us." My mother shot her a venomous look, then turned back to me, her entire demeanor shifting. The authority melted, replaced by a soft, wounded concern. "Clara, we've been having some financial stress. The new place costs more than we expected. The girls' tuition is coming up. We could really use your support now." There it was, the pivot. I nodded slowly, as if considering. "Let me get this straight," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "You sold the house I lived in without telling me. You told me I had 30 days to leave. You laughed when I asked where I was supposed to go, and now you're standing in the house I own, asking me for help. We didn't know," she insisted, her eyes beginning to glisten. If we had known you were capable of this. If you had known I was useful," I finished for her, "you would have treated me differently." "That's not fair," my father said, but the words were weak, hollow. "Isn't it?" I stood up. My hands were steady. My voice didn't waver. "That's what surprised me the most in the end. You didn't forget me by accident. You didn't simply overlook me. You made choices, over and over. You decided very clearly who mattered in this family. And it wasn't me." My mother's carefully cultivated tears spilled over. "We're still your parents." "No," I said, the word final. "You're people I'm related to. That's not the same thing." Sophia crossed her arms, her expression hardening into resentment. "So that's it? You're just cutting us off?" "I'm setting a boundary," I said. "One you drew first." Chloe started to cry in earnest, messy and loud. "You're being so cruel." I looked at her, at this sister who had never seen me. "No," I said softly. "I'm being consistent." I walked to the front door and opened it wide. The cool afternoon air swept in. "You should go." My mother stared at me, stunned into a true speechless silence. She seemed to shrink inside her expensive coat. "This isn't over," she finally whispered, but it sounded like a question. "It is," I said. "For me, it is." They left the same way they had 6 months prior, quietly, without looking back, stepping out of the life they had discarded and into one where they no longer had a key. I locked the door, turned the deadbolt with a solid thunk, and leaned against the solid wood, exhaling a breath I felt like I'd been holding for 26 years. Justice didn't feel loud or dramatic. It didn't taste sweet. It felt clean. A simple, surgical severance. And finally, absolutely, the house was truly mine. They didn't disappear right away. For weeks after that day, my phone was a persistent, glowing testament to their disbelief. My father left voicemails that always began with a stumbling apology and always ended with a rehearsed excuse. He said he should have protected me more, that he didn't realize how deep the rift had grown. I listened to the first one in its entirety. I deleted the rest without hearing them. My sister Sophia sent long, meticulously worded texts about misunderstanding and the unbreakable bonds of family. She wrote that she missed me, that she wanted us to heal, to start fresh with new clarity. The subtext, however, hummed just beneath the surface, a newfound respect, contingent entirely on my newly revealed worth. Chloe's messages were less artful, more direct, pleas for help wrapped in guilt. A new laptop for school, help with a phone bill, a loan for books. The requests were small, but their entitlement was a familiar, vast ocean. Then my Aunt Marianne came by one afternoon. She brought 2 lattes and wore a careful, conciliatory smile, the kind people use when they believe they are refereeing a simple disagreement. She sat in my living room, her eyes subtly cataloging the changes, and spoke in gentle tones about my parents' struggles, their regrets, the corrosive nature of holding on to anger. She spoke of forgiveness as if it were a gift I was withholding. I waited for her to finish, then told her the plain truth. "I'm not angry anymore, Aunt Marianne. Anger is a fire. It burns hot and then it burns out. What I feel is quiet. It's clarity." I looked around the room that was now wholly mine. I spent a lifetime shrinking myself to fit into a family that had already decided I didn't belong. Walking away wasn't an act of revenge. It was the first real act of self-respect I ever allowed myself. She nodded slowly, sipping her coffee, even though I could see she didn't fully understand. How could she? Her family had never made her feel like a ghost in her own home, but she heard the finality in my voice, and she didn't push again. After that, life settled into a deeper, truer calm. Work remained challenging and fulfilling. The house ceased being a battleground or a sanctuary and became simply a home, a place of quiet evenings, of meals cooked for one without sadness, of music played because I liked it. I hosted friends from work, people who knew the present-day Clara, not the shadow I used to be. I celebrated my birthday in September with a small dinner party, marking the day for myself, no longer waiting for a remembered card or a delayed call. Some nights, I would sit in the living room with all the lights off except for one small lamp, and I would think about how close I had come to believing their silent verdict, that I was worth less. The realization that followed was always the same and always peaceful. I wasn't. I never had been. Walking away taught me a lesson that was simple in its structure but profound in its power. Family isn't defined by who shares your last name or your genetic code. It's defined by who stands beside you when you have nothing to offer but your own unadorned self. The moment I stopped begging for a seat at their table was the moment my own life, at last, became entirely and unquestionably mine. The messages eventually trickled to a stop. The calls ceased. The silence from them became permanent, and I welcomed it. It was no longer a hollow echo, but a peaceful space I had earned. One evening months later, I found an old, forgotten picture of us all, tucked in the back of a drawer I was clearing out. It was from a beach vacation years ago, one I had been told was too expensive for me to attend. I must have found it after they left. In the photo, they were smiling brightly, squinting into the sun, a perfect unit of 4. I looked at it for a long moment. Then I tore it neatly in half, separating myself from the group, and dropped the pieces into the trash. There was no fury in the act, only a gentle final release. I felt nothing but the quiet weight of my own key in my pocket and the solid, unshakable truth of the door I could lock behind me. The silent revenge is not in taking what was theirs, but in building a life so completely your own that their absence becomes the greatest gift they ever gave you.